Imagine walking 30 kilometers every single day under a scorching Mediterranean sun or through the knee-deep mud of Germanic forests while carrying the weight of a small refrigerator strapped to your back. Now imagine doing this not for a day, not for a week, but for months, years, decades. Welcome to the life of a Roman legionary. You've seen the movies. You know the images burned into popular imagination. Heroic soldiers in gleaming, polished armor, marching in perfect formation toward glorious battle. Spartans may get the headlines, but Romans built the empire. But here's the brutal truth Hollywood will never show you. They got it completely wrong. The real story isn't about glory. It's not about honor or heroic last stands. The real story is about blisters that never heal, feet broken and rebroken on endless stone roads, starvation rations that barely kept men alive, and sheer grinding, soul-crushing endurance that transformed human beings into something else entirely. The Roman army didn't conquer half the known world because its soldiers were superhuman. They conquered it because those soldiers were systematically broken down, rebuilt and hardened into machines of relentless, unstoppable motion. Human siege engines programmed for one purpose: forward progress no matter the cost. Today we're stripping away 2,000 years of myth and propaganda. We'll reveal the actual weight they carried, every gram of agony. We'll examine the revolting liquid that kept them alive when clean water would have killed them. We'll explore the tools that built camps by night and crushed skulls by day. And we'll uncover the psychological torture disguised as discipline that forged ordinary men into the most feared military force in human history. Forget everything you think you know about Roman soldiers. This isn't the story of heroes. This is the story of a system, a machine that consumed men and produced conquerors. A system so brutal, so efficient, so perfectly calibrated to break human limitations that it didn't just defeat armies. It erased civilizations. Welcome to the true cost of empire. Welcome to the infrastructure of suffering that built the Western world. This is the brutal reality of marching in a Roman legion. Let's begin with the most crushing fact. Literally, a Roman legionary didn't simply carry his sword and shield into battle. He carried an entire mobile civilization on his back, and that civilization weighed approximately 40 kilograms, nearly 90 pounds. To put that in perspective, that's more than most modern special forces carry today. Despite having access to advanced lightweight materials, ergonomic design, and vehicle support, the Roman legionary had none of these advantages. What he had was a furca, a primitive T-shaped wooden pole, and the certain knowledge that dropping his load meant death. But what exactly constituted this mobile torture device they called a marching pack? First, his armor. The iconic larica segmentata, those overlapping steel plates that have become synonymous with Roman might, weighed 9 to 10 kilograms alone. That's 22 pounds of metal strapped to your torso before you've added a single additional item. The genius of segmented armor was its flexibility, but that same articulation required dozens of individual pieces, each adding weight, each a potential point of failure. Next, his weapons. The gladius, that legendary short sword designed for close quarters butchery, added another kilogram. The Pusca dagger, essential for camp duties and emergency combat, contributed more weight. But the real killer was the scutum shield. 10 kilograms of curved plywood, leather, and metal that covered a man from chin to knee. 10 kilograms. Imagine carrying a bowling ball in front of your chest for 8 hours while hiking a mountain trail. His helmet, the galea, another 2 kilograms of bronze and iron protection. His Caligay military sandals, designed for thousands of miles but heavy with metal studs and reinforced leather. Spare clothes because wet wool in Germanic winters meant death from exposure. Then came the survival equipment that separated Roman legionaries from barbarian raiders. A personal cooking pot, because army rations required preparation. A hand mill for grinding grain into flour, because bread was life and pre-ground flour spoiled. An entrenching tool because every single night meant building a fortified camp from nothing. Wooden stakes for palisade construction, because those camps needed walls. Water flask because dehydration killed faster than Germanic spears. Personal rations for 3 days minimum, grain, hard cheese, salt pork, olive oil. Emergency equipment, needle and thread for equipment repair, whetstone for weapon maintenance, spare leather for gear replacement. Personal items, Letters from home, perhaps a small shrine to household gods, dice for gambling away the pain. Add it all up, and you approach 40 kilograms. But here's what no museum display or historical reenactment will ever convey. It wasn't just the weight, it was the distribution. No ergonomic backpacks with padded straps and weight-distributing hip belts. No advanced suspension systems or breathable mesh backing. Just that furca, a simple T-shaped pole slung over one shoulder, with everything else hanging like pendulums from leather straps and rope. Picture it. 40 kilograms of gear swinging, bouncing, shifting with every step. The shield alone, strapped to your back, acted like a sail in crosswinds, throwing off your balance on mountain paths. The helmet bounced against your skull. The armor plates shifted and pinched. The cooking pot clanged against your tools with every footfall, creating a symphony of misery that announced your approach to enemies miles away. Marching 30 kilometers a day under these conditions wasn't exercise. It was systematic torture. Blisters formed within hours, burst, reformed, then became infected ulcers that never properly healed. Shoulders bled where leather straps cut through skin and muscle. Knees buckled under the relentless pounding of Roman roads designed for durability, not comfort, with stone surfaces that transmitted every impact directly into leg bones and spinal columns. The psychological impact was equally devastating. Every morning you strapped 40 kilograms to your body knowing you would carry it until sunset. Every step was a small act of defiance against your body's screaming protests. Every kilometer stretched into eternity. Desertion wasn't just about cowardice or homesickness. Many deserters were simply broken men whose bodies had reached the absolute limit of human endurance. Men who would rather face execution than take another step with that crushing load. But here's the truly diabolical genius of the Roman system. They knew exactly what they were doing. The load wasn't just about carrying necessary equipment. It was about psychological conditioning. Every day, every step, every gram of weight screamed the same message into a legionary's consciousness. Keep moving or die. Your comfort means nothing. Your pain means nothing. Only forward motion matters. Only the mission matters. Only Rome matters. The marching load transformed ordinary men into something beyond human limits. It broke their attachment to comfort, to safety, to the normal human desire for rest and ease. Day after day, mile after mile, it programmed them for one single overwhelming truth. Stopping meant death. Movement meant survival. And Rome never ever stopped. This wasn't an army in any conventional sense. This was a factory assembly line for manufacturing human weapons, and the raw material was suffering made flesh. Thirsty? Too bad. Roman legionaries didn't drink clean, refreshing water. They didn't enjoy wine like civilized citizens back in Rome. They drank Pusca, a foul, sour, acidic mixture of water and wine vinegar that would make modern soldiers revolt. To us, 2,000 years removed from the realities of ancient hygiene, Pusca sounds like deliberate punishment, a cruel joke played on men already suffering under impossible conditions. To them, it was liquid salvation. And here's why. One word: bacteria. Rivers, wells, streams. Every source of natural water was a potential death trap. Dysentery could wipe out an entire cohort faster than a Germanic ambush. Typhoid, cholera, and a dozen other waterborne diseases killed more Roman soldiers than all the barbarian tribes combined. Clean water was a luxury that didn't exist outside major Roman cities with proper aqueduct systems. But the Romans discovered something remarkable. Acetic acid kills pathogens. The same chemical that made Pusca taste like punishment also made it safe to drink. Every sip was ancient chemical warfare, not against human enemies, but against the microscopic killers that lurked in every natural water source. Modern science has confirmed what Roman quartermasters learned through trial and error. Vinegars. Acetic acid content creates an environment hostile to harmful bacteria, while remaining safe for human consumption. Pusca wasn't just a drink. It was a survival technology disguised as military ration. But the genius of Pusca extended far beyond basic safety. It was a performance enhancer. The sourness triggered saliva production, tricking the brain into feeling more hydrated than it actually was. Crucial when water sources were uncertain, and rationing meant the difference between reaching the next camp alive or collapsing on the road. Recent studies of acidic sports drinks have confirmed that the Roman military accidentally created the ancient equivalent of Gatorade. The acid content improved fluid retention, helped maintain electrolyte balance, and even provided trace nutrients from the fermentation process. Soldiers who drank Pusca could march longer, fight harder, and recover faster than men dependent on plain water alone. Roman legionaries carried Pusca in wooden canteens called lagunculi, carefully constructed containers that wouldn't contaminate the acidic contents with metallic tastes. They sipped it throughout the day, not in large gulps but in small measured doses that maintained hydration without overwhelming their systems. Some soldiers, when supplies permitted, added honey to mask the harsh taste. Others included herbs, mint, when available, or local plants that provided additional medicinal benefits, but many didn't bother with such luxuries. After weeks of campaigning, they actually craved the sour bite. Their bodies had adapted to associate that sharp, acidic taste with survival, with life itself. There's even biblical evidence of Pusca's universality. During the crucifixion, a Roman soldier offered Jesus Pusca on a sponge, not to mock his suffering, but as a genuine act of mercy. To offer your own drink, your own carefully rationed survival fluid, was the only kindness a common legionary could show. That's how deeply embedded Pusca was in military culture. It wasn't just a beverage, it was a shared bond of survival. The social hierarchy of Roman military drinking told its own story. Wine was reserved for officers. Centurions and tribunes enjoyed proper vintages with their evening meals, safely distanced from the enlisted men's suffering. Beer was considered barbarian swill, fit only for Germanic and Celtic tribes who didn't understand civilization. But Pusca was the great equalizer. Every legionary, from the newest recruit to the veteran preparing for his final campaign, drank the same sour mixture. It created a democracy of misery, a shared experience that bound the ranks together more effectively than any oath or ceremony. The psychological impact was profound. When you're exhausted, demoralized, thousands of miles from home, and everything familiar has been stripped away, even something as simple as a familiar taste becomes an anchor to sanity. The daily ritual of mixing Pusca, the communal sharing of the same bitter drink, the knowledge that your comrades were enduring the same assault on their taste buds, it all contributed to unit cohesion. More importantly, Pusca represented Roman pragmatism at its most essential. Function over form, survival over comfort, efficiency over pleasure. The empire didn't expand through luxury or indulgence. It expanded through men willing to drink vinegar if vinegar meant staying alive long enough to plant Roman eagles on distant shores. Modern military nutritionists, studying ancient Roman logistics, have concluded that Pusca was perhaps the single most important factor in Rome's ability to maintain armies in the field for extended periods. While enemy forces struggled with disease and dehydration, Roman legionaries remained healthy, hydrated, and combat effective. The barbarian tribes facing Roman expansion had superior individual warriors, familiar terrain, and desperate motivation to defend their homelands. But they didn't have Pusca. They didn't have the systematic, unglamorous, foul-tasting technology that kept armies functional across continents and campaigns. Victory, it turned out, didn't flow from heroic speeches or noble sacrifices. Victory came from the canteen, from the willingness to drink liquid punishment if that punishment meant tomorrow you could still hold a sword. Sometimes the difference between empire and extinction isn't courage. Sometimes it's just better chemistry. Look at any Hollywood depiction of Roman warfare and you'll see swords, gleaming gladi thrusting and slashing in dramatic duels. But here's what the movies always get wrong. The sword wasn't the primary weapon of a Roman legionary. The scutum was. This wasn't just a piece of defensive equipment. The scutum, that massive curved rectangular slab of plywood, leather and metal, and was identity, offense, defense, and Roman civilization itself, all strapped to a man's left arm. Measuring roughly 120 centimeters tall and 75 centimeters wide, the scutum covered a legionary from chin to knee when properly positioned. But its genius wasn't in what it protected, it was in what it enabled. Locked together in formation, individual scuta transformed into something far more terrifying than personal protection. They became the testudo, the tortoise formation that has become legendary for good reason. Imagine hundreds of shields fitting together like puzzle pieces, creating an impenetrable shell against arrows, rocks, boiling oil, or any other projectile defenders could hurl from city walls. But the testudo was just one application. In open battle, the real horror of the scutum revealed itself in close combat. Roman legionaries didn't just block with their shields, though. They punched. That metal boss in the center, the umbo, wasn't decorative. It was a skull-crushing battering ram designed to deliver bone-shattering impacts at close range. Thrust forward in perfect unison, a wall of scuta could physically shove entire enemy formations backward, breaking their cohesion before Roman swords ever entered the equation. Picture the physics. 10 kilograms of hardened wood and metal, backed by years of conditioning and training, driven forward by men who had marched thousands of miles carrying 40-kilogram loads. The impact wasn't just physical trauma, it was psychological devastation. Enemy warriors, no matter how brave, found themselves literally pushed backward by an advancing wall of Roman determination. Carrying the scutum on the march added another layer of systematic torture to the legionary experience. Strapped to the back, it transformed each soldier into a walking billboard. Unit insignia painted in bright colors announced Roman presence from miles away. Enemy scouts didn't need to get close to count Roman numbers, they just needed to count the shields. But this visibility was intentional psychological warfare. The sight of hundreds, thousands of identical shields moving in perfect formation across the landscape sent a clear message to anyone watching. Roman discipline approaches. Roman order comes. Resistance is futile. At night, those same shields became construction materials. Roman engineering manuals specified exactly how scuta should be incorporated into temporary fortifications. Positioned vertically and locked together, they formed the outer wall of the camp perimeter. Nothing was wasted. Nothing served only one purpose. The same shield that protected you in battle also protected your sleep. The psychological attachment between legionary and scutum went far deeper than mere equipment maintenance. To lose your scutum in battle was worse than losing your sword, worse than losing your armor, worse than suffering wounds that would cripple you for life. Losing your scutum meant disgrace, court-martial, execution. But not just your execution. Your entire contubernium, your 8-man tent group, faced punishment for your failure. The shield represented not just personal survival, but collective responsibility. Roman military law was explicit. Surrender your sword if you must. Abandon your pack if necessary, but never ever abandon your scutum. Better to die holding it than live without it. The shield wasn't just wood and metal, it was honor, duty, and Roman identity made tangible. This created a feedback loop of peer pressure that modern military psychologists recognize as one of the most powerful motivational tools available. You didn't just fight for Rome or for your own life or even for glory. You fought because dropping your shield meant condemning 7 other men. Men who had shared their food, their warmth, their suffering with you for months or years. The scutum also served as a canvas for unit pride and individual expression within the rigid constraints of military conformity. Painted designs weren't just identification, they were art, history, and motivation combined. Lightning bolts for Jupiter's favor, eagles for Roman power. Personal symbols earned through campaigns and battles. Enemy warriors learned to fear not just Roman tactics, but Roman shields specifically. Gallic chieftains and Germanic war leaders knew that breaking a Roman shield wall meant victory, but also knew that Roman shield walls simply didn't break. They bent, they absorbed incredible punishment, but they held. And when they advanced, when that wall of scuta began moving forward with mechanical precision, that's when brave warriors broke and ran. Not from Roman swords, but from Roman shields. From the awful inevitability of that advancing wall of discipline and determination, the scutum transformed individual soldiers into components of a larger machine. It wasn't personal protection. It was civilization itself, strapped to a man's arm and moving forward one inexorable step at a time. Rome didn't conquer through superior weapons or tactics. Rome conquered through superior shields, through the simple, terrifying promise that Roman order would advance and nothing, no hero, no army, no amount of courage, could make it stop. Rome didn't just fight battles. Rome erased cities. And it accomplished this systematic obliteration not through rage or fury, but through the most terrifying weapon in the Roman arsenal: infinite, methodical patience. When Roman legions arrived outside a defended city, they didn't prepare for battle. They prepared for construction, engineering, architecture of destruction that could take months or even years to complete. Because Rome understood a fundamental truth that escaped most ancient civilizations: time was a weapon, and they had more of it than anyone else. The ballista embodied this philosophy perfectly. Don't call it a catapult, that's Hollywood ignorance. The ballista was a precision instrument, a giant crossbow engineered with the same mathematical precision that built Roman aqueducts and roads, firing iron-tipped bolts the size of spears with enough force to punch through 3 men standing in line, then pin all 3 to a wooden wall behind them. But here's what made the ballista truly terrifying. It wasn't designed for quick victory. It was designed for psychological torture on an industrial scale. Day after day, week after week, month after month, those massive bolts would streak over city walls with mechanical regularity. Not enough to breach the defenses immediately, but enough to make every moment of life inside the walls a game of lethal chance. Defenders couldn't sleep, couldn't eat in peace, couldn't gather in groups without risking sudden random death from above. The ballista didn't just kill bodies, it murdered hope. Then came the onager, the true nightmare of Roman siege warfare. This torsion-powered monster launched 50-pound stones in high arcs that cleared defensive walls and smashed into buildings, temples, homes. But again, the goal wasn't immediate destruction. The goal was the slow, systematic crushing of civilian morale. Imagine living under constant bombardment. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the onager launching its deadly cargo. You can't see it coming. You can't predict where it will land. You just know that somewhere in your city every few minutes another building collapses, another family dies, another piece of your world disappears forever. But the true genius and horror of Roman siege warfare wasn't the destruction itself. It was the routine. Roman siege camps were built with the same meticulous precision as permanent military bases. Proper latrines, bakeries for fresh bread, hospitals for treating wounded soldiers, workshops for maintaining and improving siege equipment. The message was unmistakable. We're not leaving, ever. We can do this longer than you can. Roman soldiers rotated duties with clockwork precision. Some crews manned the artillery, maintaining the constant bombardment. Others dug approach tunnels, working steadily toward the foundations of defensive walls. Still others stood guard against desperate sorties by increasingly starved and desperate defenders. All of this while listening to the hypnotic rhythm of mechanical destruction. Thump, reload, aim, thump, reload, aim. For months, sleep became impossible inside besieged cities. Not just because of the bombardment, but because of the sounds, the constant creaking of torsion springs being wound tight, the shouted commands of Roman engineers, the systematic hammering of construction. Even when the stones stopped falling, the defenders knew the Romans were still out there, still building, still preparing. Roman psychological warfare reached truly diabolical levels during extended sieges. Corpses of captured messengers, launched over walls with plague warnings attached. Heads of defeated relief forces, catapulted into courtyards where families would recognize fathers, sons, brothers. The Romans had learned that terror was more efficient than simple destruction, but perhaps most cruel of all, the deception engines. Roman engineers would construct fake siege towers, elaborate wooden shells designed to draw defenders into wasting precious arrows and javelins. Thousands of projectiles would be launched at empty frameworks while real Roman preparations continued elsewhere, undetected and unhindered. When defenders finally exhausted their ammunition attacking phantoms, the real siege towers would appear. Fully manned, properly armored, and unstoppable. The worst psychological torture was the silence. After weeks or months of constant bombardment, Roman engines would suddenly stop. Not because Rome had shown mercy, not because negotiations had succeeded, but because the preliminary phase was complete. The softening was finished. In that terrible quiet, defenders knew what was coming. The final assault. The gates would shudder under the impact of massive battering rams. War horns would blare across the Roman lines. And then the legionaries, fresh, well-fed, properly equipped, would pour through the breaches like water through a broken dam. No berserker rage. No wild fury, just methodical, systematic slaughter performed by men who had spent months preparing for this exact moment. Men who had eaten regular meals while defenders starved. Men who had slept in comfortable barracks while their enemies cowered under bombardment. Men who approached the final battle not as desperate warriors but as craftsmen, completing a long, careful project. Roman siege warfare wasn't about martial prowess or tactical brilliance. It was about engineering, logistics, and the slow, inexorable crushing of human hope. It was about demonstrating that Roman resources were infinite, Roman patience was endless, and Roman victory was as inevitable as sunrise. Cities that might have withstood direct assault for years simply collapsed. Not from external destruction, but from internal breakdown. Starvation, disease, despair, and the awful certainty that tomorrow would be worse than today, and next month would be worse than this month. Rome didn't win sieges through superior weapons or tactics. Rome won sieges through superior time management, through the terrifying promise that Roman engineers could build faster than defenders could rebuild. Roman supplies would last longer than enemy food stores, and Roman determination would outlast any amount of courage. When the walls finally fell, they buried more than buildings and bodies. They buried the very idea that Rome could be stopped. Not every Roman weapon needed a brave soldier to wield it. Some worked best when forgotten completely, lying in wait like metallic predators, hidden in tall grass or buried in sandy soil, patient and silent until the perfect moment to strike. Enter the caltrop. 4 iron spikes arranged in perfect geometric harmony, so that no matter how it landed, one spike always pointed straight up. Step on it barefoot, instant agony and crippling injury. Heavy cavalry charge, horses collapse screaming, riders catapulted to bone-crushing impacts, entire formations dissolving into chaos within seconds. The genius of the caltrop wasn't its lethality, though a spike through the foot often meant death from infection in an age without antibiotics. The genius was its psychological impact. Roman engineers would scatter thousands of these devices across open fields before major engagements, turning what appeared to be perfect cavalry terrain into invisible minefields. Enemy commanders, seeing clear ground perfect for mounted charges, would order their finest warriors forward only to watch in horror as their cavalry, the elite, the aristocrats, the heroes of their culture, were reduced to screaming, thrashing victims of Roman engineering. No glorious single combat, no heroic last stands, just physics and cruelty working in perfect harmony. But caltrops were merely one tool in Rome's arsenal of invisible warfare. Then there were the chains. Not chains for binding prisoners or dragging siege equipment. Chains for murder, stretched ankle-high between trees, stakes, or concealed posts. These simple devices transformed cavalry charges from displays of martial prowess into exercises in mass suicide. Picture the physics. A war horse at full gallop, carrying an armored rider, hits a chain stretched 18 inches above ground level. The horse's legs fold instantly. 2,000 pounds of muscle, bone, and metal flip forward in a catastrophic tumble. Necks snap. Legs shatter. Riders disappear beneath crushing weight, if they're lucky enough to die quickly. The psychological impact on surviving cavalry was devastating. Horses are intelligent animals. They learn to associate certain terrain with pain and death. After a single encounter with Roman chain traps, entire cavalry units would refuse to charge across open ground, no matter how desperately their riders spurred them forward. These weren't honorable weapons by any cultural standard of the ancient world. Germanic tribes valued individual combat prowess. Celtic warriors sang songs about brave deaths in battle. Roman engineers sang songs about efficiency ratios and casualty statistics. But here's what made these weapons truly terrifying. They required no skill to deploy. A handful of auxiliary troops, not even full legionaries, could sew enough caltrops to halt an entire enemy cavalry wing. A couple of slaves working under cover of darkness could string chains that would massacre tribal champions who had trained for warfare. Their entire lives, the Romans understood, something their enemies refused to acknowledge. War wasn't about honor, courage, or individual heroism. War was about results, and results came from systematic application of superior technology, not from superior warriors. Roman field manuals. Yes, they had actual written manuals for this. Specified precise deployment patterns for maximum effectiveness. Caltrops should be scattered in random patterns to prevent enemy engineers from clearing safe paths. Chain traps should be positioned to funnel surviving cavalry into prepared killing zones, where ballista crews waited with pre-ranged targets. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing was improvised. Every invisible weapon was part of a larger system designed to channel enemy forces into predetermined destruction zones. The psychological warfare extended beyond the immediate battle. Stories of Roman trap warfare spread faster than Roman legions themselves. Tribal councils heard detailed accounts of proud cavalry charges ending in screaming disasters. Young warriors who had dreamed of glorious mounted combat began having nightmares about invisible spikes and hidden chains. Even when Romans didn't deploy these weapons, enemy forces had to assume they were there. Every cavalry charge became an exercise in terror. Every open field became suspect. Every blade of grass might conceal a caltrop. Every shadow might hide a chain. This strategic paranoia was exactly what Roman commanders intended. Enemy armies that spent precious time and energy checking for traps, clearing suspected areas, and advancing cautiously were armies that had already lost the psychological war before the first sword was drawn. In traditional Roman military hierarchy, glory belonged to the centurions leading frontal assaults. Honor belonged to the legionaries holding the line against overwhelming odds. But victory? Victory belonged to the anonymous engineer who had placed a handful of iron spikes in exactly the right location, 3 hours before dawn. Rome didn't conquer through superior courage or martial skill. Rome conquered through superior preparation and the willingness to use any weapon, no matter how dishonorable, that delivered results. Efficiency over honor. Always, without exception. Meet the dolabra, the Roman legionary's Swiss army knife from hell. Part axe for clearing obstacles, part pickaxe for breaking hard ground, part shovel for digging fortifications, and when circumstances required it, part skull-crushing weapon of close-quarters annihilation. Officially, according to Roman military manuals, the dolabra was an entrenching tool, a simple implement for construction and camp preparation, nothing more than a utilitarian piece of engineering equipment that every legionary carried as standard kit. Unofficially, it was a close-quarters nightmare that could split a barbarian's collarbone like kindling. The design was deceptively simple. A heavy iron head mounted on a sturdy wooden handle, with one end shaped like an axe blade and the other formed into a broad pick or mattock. But simplicity was the source of its devastating effectiveness. No complex mechanisms to fail, no delicate parts to break, just solid iron and wood, engineered to deliver maximum force with minimum effort. Every single Roman legionary carried one, not officers, not specialists. Every single man in every cohort of every legion across the empire, and every single night, regardless of weather, terrain, or tactical situation, they used these tools to construct a complete fortified camp in under 2 hours. Picture the logistics. 6,000 men with dolabra, working in perfect coordination, transforming empty ground into a fortress before sunset. Ditches 3 meters wide and 2 meters deep, ramparts crowned with sharpened stakes, watchtowers at regular intervals, gates with proper defensive approaches, an entire military city built from nothing but sweat, soil, and systematically applied engineering principles. Then, if the camp came under night attack, those same construction tools became weapons of desperate lethality. No need to fumble for your gladius in the dark. No time to strap on your scutum when barbarians came screaming over the ramparts. Just grab the dolabra lying beside your bedroll and start swinging. The weight distribution was perfect for combat applications. The iron head provided the mass needed for bone-crushing impacts, while the wooden handle gave sufficient leverage for devastating swings in confined spaces. Unlike a sword, which required room to maneuver, the dolabra was designed for close work, perfect for the cramped conditions inside a camp under assault. But here's what made the dolabra truly representative of Roman military philosophy. Everything had dual purpose. Rest periods were construction periods. Construction training was combat training. There was no distinction between preparation and warfare because warfare never stopped. A legionary drilling with his dolabra to dig faster trenches was simultaneously training to split enemy skulls more efficiently. The same muscle memory that could excavate a camp latrine in record time could also cave in a barbarian's ribcage during a midnight raid. The same tool that built Roman civilization also buried its enemies. Roman engineering manuals specified exact techniques for dolabra usage in construction. Proper grip, optimal swing mechanics, efficient body positioning to prevent fatigue during extended digging operations. But those same specifications created perfect combat training without requiring separate weapons drills. Enemy tribes learned to fear Roman camps not just as defensive positions, but as demonstrations of impossible discipline and organization. Armies that had been marching all day, carrying crushing loads, exhausted and demoralized, would arrive at empty ground and within hours create fortifications that would have taken weeks to construct using normal methods. The psychological impact was staggering. How do you defeat an enemy that can create a fortress from nothing? How do you surprise soldiers who sleep behind walls they built themselves? How do you break men who treat backbreaking labor as routine preparation? Germanic chieftains and Gallic war leaders quickly realized that attacking Roman camps meant facing not just professional soldiers, but professional soldiers fighting from prepared positions they had personally constructed to maximize defensive advantages. Every ditch had been dug to the perfect depth. Every rampart positioned at the optimal angle. Every approach carefully planned to funnel attackers into killing zones. More importantly, the daily routine of camp construction reinforced the fundamental Roman military principle. Nothing was left to chance, nothing was improvised, nothing was good enough, the same obsessive attention to detail that created perfect fortifications. Every night also created perfect battle formations every day. The dolabra embodied this obsession with systematic perfection. It wasn't just a tool or a weapon, it was a symbol of Roman determination to control every aspect of military existence. Sleep required walls, so walls would be built. Walls required digging, so digging would be mastered. And if that digging tool could also serve as a weapon, perfect efficiency. Roman logisticians understood that armies carrying specialized equipment for every possible situation would collapse under their own weight. But an army where every tool served multiple functions, where every skill contributed to multiple capabilities, where every piece of equipment enhanced both construction and destruction, that was an army that could march to the ends of the earth and still be ready to fight when it arrived. The dolabra transformed ordinary soldiers into engineers, engineers into warriors, and warriors into the builders of empire. It represented the Roman genius for making strength serve multiple purposes, for turning necessity into advantage, for ensuring that even rest was preparation for the next battle. That's how empires are built, not with speeches or inspiration, but with sweat, soil, and the willingness to turn every shovel into a skull splitter when circumstances demand it. Discipline wasn't taught in the Roman legions. It was beaten in, and the instrument of that systematic brutality was the flagrum, a short whip with multiple leather thongs, sometimes knotted, sometimes tipped with bone or metal fragments, designed for one specific purpose: the modification of human behavior through controlled application of pain. Minor infractions, flogging; major failures, flogging; successful completion of difficult missions, sometimes flogging just to reinforce that pain was the natural state of existence, and anything better was a privilege that could be revoked without notice. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake, though the results were undeniably cruel. This was behavioral engineering on an industrial scale. Roman military theorists had discovered something that modern psychology would later confirm. Systematic application of controlled trauma creates predictable responses in human subjects. Centurions carried their flagra not as punishment tools to be retrieved when discipline problems arose, but as extensions of command authority. A quick flick across the shoulders during drill, a sharp lash for marching too slowly, 10 strokes for losing equipment, 50 for questioning orders, death for desertion, but only after extensive flogging to ensure the lesson reached every witness. The sound alone, that distinctive whistle crack of leather, cutting through air and connecting with flesh gag, was enough to snap an entire cohort into perfect attention. Pavlovian conditioning applied with mathematical precision. Hear the whistle, pain follows. Avoid the behavior that triggers the whistle. But here's what made the Roman system truly diabolical. The floggings were public, ritualized, and completely predictable. Not random outbursts of violence that might inspire rebellion, but systematic demonstrations that reinforced the fundamental hierarchy of Roman military existence. Every legionary knew exactly which behaviors would result in flogging. Every centurion knew exactly how many strokes were prescribed for each infraction. There was no uncertainty, no arbitrariness, no possibility of escape through ignorance or confusion. The rules were clear. The consequences were certain. Compliance was the only rational choice. Modern military historians studying Roman disciplinary records have noted the sophisticated understanding of human psychology embedded in flagrum protocols. Punishments were calibrated to be severe enough to modify behavior, but not so extreme as to permanently disable valuable soldiers. The goal wasn't destruction, it was reconstruction. Pain thresholds were carefully mapped, recovery times calculated, psychological impacts measured and adjusted based on individual responses and unit cohesion requirements. Roman centurions were essentially behavioral scientists armed with whips. The flagrum created what modern psychologists recognize as learned helplessness combined with hypervigilant compliance. Legionaries developed an almost supernatural awareness of centurion moods, subtle changes in routine, and microscopic deviations from perfect performance that might trigger punishment. This hyper-awareness translated directly into combat effectiveness. Men conditioned to instantly recognize and respond to threat signals from their own officers became equally adept at reading enemy intentions, terrain dangers, and tactical opportunities. Fear-sharpened senses saved more Roman lives than armor ever did. The psychological conditioning went even deeper. Legionaries learned to associate pain with normalcy and comfort with suspicion. When things were going well, when no floggings occurred for several days, experienced soldiers became nervous rather than relieved. They knew that in the Roman system, prolonged calm meant something worse was coming. This created a military culture where soldiers actually sought out minor punishments as psychological relief. Better a few lashes for a small infraction than the building anxiety of waiting for major discipline to fall. The flagrum became not just a tool of punishment, but a tool of perverse comfort, proof that the system was still functioning normally. Enemy forces facing Roman legions quickly learned that they weren't fighting normal men. They were fighting humans who had been systematically reprogrammed to view suffering as routine. Pain is acceptable and death is preferable to the shame of disappointing their centurions. Germanic warriors, Celtic champions, and other tribal fighters brought courage, skill, and desperate motivation to battle. But Romans brought something far more dangerous. Complete indifference to personal suffering combined with absolute terror of failing to meet expectations. The flagrum created soldiers who would continue fighting with wounds that would incapacitate normal men, who would maintain formation discipline under devastating fire, and who would follow orders that guaranteed death, because the alternative, facing their centurion's disappointment, was literally unthinkable. Roman military efficiency wasn't achieved through inspiration, patriotism, or noble ideals. It was achieved through systematic psychological conditioning that transformed individual human beings into components of a larger machine. The flagrum was the primary tool of that transformation. Pain became predictability. Predictability became cohesion. Cohesion became tactical superiority, and tactical superiority became continental conquest. The flagrum didn't just mark flesh, though the scars were permanent reminders of Roman discipline. It marked minds, souls, and the very conception of what human beings could be conditioned to endure and accomplish. Modern armies achieve unit cohesion through shared hardship, common purpose, and group identity. Roman armies achieved it through shared trauma, universal fear, and the certain knowledge that individual survival depended on collective performance. The difference? Roman legions conquered half the known world, and those minds, forged in systematic suffering, built a civilization that lasted 1,000 years. So there you have it, the brutal, unvarnished truth about what it meant to march in a Roman legion. Strip away 2 millennia of romantic mythology. Ignore the Hollywood heroics, and what remains? The Roman legionary wasn't a hero. He was a system, a walking arsenal of suffering, endurance, and ruthless mechanical efficiency. His weapons weren't just steel and bronze. They were vinegar that burned his throat, spikes that crippled enemy horses, shovels that doubled as skull crushers, and whips that carved discipline into his very soul. His victories weren't won in glorious cavalry charges or dramatic single combat. They were won in blistered feet that never healed, Sleepless sieges that lasted years, silent terror scattered in grass at ankle height, and the systematic application of pain until human behavior became as predictable as engineering calculations. Rome didn't rule through inspiration or noble ideals. Rome ruled through infrastructure, the infrastructure of suffering, through systems so perfectly calibrated to break human limitations that they didn't just defeat armies, they erased the very possibility of resistance. Ask yourself, could you march 30 kilometers a day under 40 kilograms of equipment? Could you drink vinegar to survive while your enemies died of dysentery? Could you swing a construction tool like a battle axe when barbarians came screaming over your camp walls? Could you maintain perfect formation discipline while your centurion's whip carved behavioral modification into your back? If not, if the very thought of such systematic brutality makes you recoil, then maybe you finally understand why Rome lasted 1,000 years while everyone else fell. Maybe you understand why Germanic tribes, with superior individual warriors, couldn't stop Roman expansion, why Celtic champions fighting for their own soil couldn't break Roman formations, why civilizations with centuries of military tradition crumbled before soldiers who treated agony as routine preparation. The Roman legionary was proof that human beings, properly conditioned, could transcend every limitation that biology and psychology imposed. Pain tolerance, endurance thresholds, psychological breaking points, all of it could be systematically overcome through the right application of controlled trauma and mechanical precision. Rome didn't conquer the world because Romans were superhuman. Rome conquered the world because Romans had created a system for manufacturing superhumans from ordinary men. The price? The complete destruction of individual identity, personal comfort, and normal human responses to suffering. The transformation of citizens into components, men into machinery, humans into weapons that happened to be made of flesh instead of steel. That's the true legacy of the Roman legion. Not heroism, not glory, but the terrifying proof that systematic brutality, properly applied, could build civilizations that lasted centuries. Like this deep dive into the machinery of empire, subscribe for more uncomfortable truths about history's greatest military forces. Because next time, we're exploring what happened when these human machines finally broke, and what it took to bring down a system that had devoured men and birthed empires for 1,000 years. The fall is always more brutal than the rise.